listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sputnik reports the state of our union is garbled mumbling. What will Biden say in his big speech to Congress? Biden is gearing up for his third presidential address to a joint session of Congress tonight. In American political tradition, State of the Union speeches are designed to lay out the head of state's top domestic foreign policy priorities. What's Biden going to say this time? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So as the empire crumbles and as U.S. allies are being asked to participate in conflicts and they can't seem to bring their own bullets, what's President Biden's hook tonight? What's he up there going? What's he going to do?
Well, I think a major question will be to what extent he will focus on foreign policy, because obviously that's a major weakness of his administration. That is to say, we expected early on some sort of deal with the Iranians concerning the nuclear capacity that they supposedly have. Instead, we witnessed the spectacle a few days ago of Israel and the United States engaging in massive military maneuvers in Iran's backyard. And certainly that does not bode well. It complicates further the ability of Washington to come to an accord with regard to what appears to be its major foreign policy priority, mentioning Ukraine. And I say that because there was a striking article in the Wall Street Journal just yesterday that suggested that the apparent cooperation between Iran and Russia is deepening with regard to drone technology. And apparently, Iran has something to contribute in that area that it's sharing with Moscow. And mentioning the apparent foreign policy priority of Ukraine raises another contradiction, because that's said out of one side of their mouth. Out of the other side of their mouth, we're told that China is the major priority. Witness the balloonacy of the last 24 to 48 hours executed by ballonatics. And relations with China will become ever more complicated with every passing day, which calls into question why Ukraine is the major foreign policy priority. Even if you turn to domestic matters, if the commentators and pundits are going to be honest with their audience, they'll have to raise certain conflicts and contradictions. For example, according to the New York Times, a major theme of Mr. Biden at the State of the Union will be a program to tax the wealthy and redistribute those funds to the less affluent. I'm sure that may come as a shock and surprise to the less affluent, many of whom, as you know, are suffering through a typical state of homelessness, which is stalking the land like a grim reaper, and is exacerbated by the fact that our tax dollars are now going to one of the most corrupt regimes on planet Earth, speaking of the government in Ukraine. And so one might wonder why the administration might talk about these redistributive methods with regard to taxation when they could easily slash the provisions to the Zelensky regime and have redistribution on that level. Likewise, we're told that Mr. Biden will make a full-throated call for restrictions on assault weapons. But I dare say that restrictions on weapons is something that the Somali people would like to see Washington engage in. Recall that in the past few weeks, there have been reported and repeated U.S. military raids on that East African country. We know that other kinds of weapons are being unsheathed to use against socialist Cuba, speaking of the blockade, which I doubt will come up tonight at the State of the Union. And certainly with regard to the long-suffering Palestinians, they would like to see the United States engage in some sort of weapons restriction with regard to how the Israeli government is being supplied quite royally in order to further repress the Palestinians. So there will be a lot of contradictions in the State of the Union. Whether or not the pundits and commentators will point them out is another question, of course.
One of the things that seems to be remarkably absent from the dialogue of U.S. presidents when it comes to the State of the Union and national addresses is Africa, and there's a lot going on right now. We see that Sergei Lavrov has been in Africa pushing back against U.S. hegemony. Your thoughts, A, on that, and B, do you think that since Africa is in the crosshairs of the U.S., that there could be any discussion on that?
I tend to doubt it. I tend to doubt if Africa will come up at the State of the Union, although it well should. You mentioned Sergei Lavrov's visit, the Russian foreign minister, to Pretoria in the last week or so. And that is in anticipation of military maneuvers between the South African military and the Russian military, apparently involving the Chinese military as well, which has won a few plaudits in Washington. I should also mention in this context that the immediate northern neighbor of South Africa, speaking of Zimbabwe, a much sanctioned Zimbabwe, entertained for a number of days in this past week the president of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko. And of course, Belarus is one of Moscow's closest allies in Europe. There is a contradiction in U.S. policy towards that region. That is to say that on the one hand, one would think that Washington is reconciled to the fact that apartheid was defeated in South Africa and colonialism was defeated in Zimbabwe. But if you look at the latter country in particular, you notice that Washington has sanctioned Zimbabwe relentlessly because that government decided to reclaim the land from the European invaders. The contradiction is that Washington has this more than sentimental tie to the original invaders because they resemble the European invaders who entered North America some centuries ago. And likewise, if you look at the fact that the new chief of staff, Mr. Zeitz, the former COVID coordinator, is married into one of the leading families of apartheid South Africa that made a major fortune based upon the brutalization of African minors, and the marital choices and partnership choices of Hunter Biden's notorious son leans in that same direction. And so I don't think that Africa will come up, because if it did, Washington would once again have to expose the contradictions and the conflicts that it would prefer to keep hidden.
Final point on Africa, when you look at Lavrov's visit to Pretoria, you look at the joint military maneuvers, as well as his most recent trip to Mali and his discussions and commitments of military support to Mali, is this a not so subtle affront to AFRICOM? And is this Russia's, I guess, opening up another front, so to speak, as it relates to undermining the U.S. Hegemonic control through AFRICOM?
Well, as I see things, fundamentally, African nations have had it up to their keister with the inept, incompetent, exploitative practices of the North Atlantic nations. Speaking of Mali, you know that they have taken moves to expel the former colonizers, speaking of the French occupation forces, and they have decided to take up the offer from Moscow to help the Bamako regime combat a so-called religious insurgency. I think that AFRICOM, in many ways, has been a public relations disaster for U.S. imperialism, because at the same time, U.S. imperialism is railing against China, and China, of course, has just built a sparkling, spanking new headquarters for the Centers for Disease Control of Africa in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, built railways from Nairobi to Mombasa on the Indian Ocean coast, built railways from Addis Ababa through Djibouti, a major port. And so Africa is wondering when Washington, instead of seeking to undermine China's relationship in Africa, instead will seek to compete with China on those same terms, in terms of not supplying military materiel through the bad offices of AFRICOM, but instead trying to build infrastructure, trying to assist the health, livelihood, and well-being of African peoples, something that Washington has difficulty doing in its own backyard, speaking of its tortured relationship with African Americans.
David Swanson has an interesting article in antiwar.com we'd like to get your thoughts on. The Monroe Doctrine is soaked in blood.
Well, that's, I'm afraid to say, a kind of understatement. Recall that it was circa 1823 that U.S. President James Monroe sought to keep European nations out of this hemisphere. Now, supposedly, that was because the United States had a benign approach to its neighborhood. And actually, it was because the United States wanted to feast and plunder and pillage the hemisphere all its own. Likewise, the United States made a pledge that correspondingly it would keep its nose out of European affairs, which it did not. Recall that when there was the Titanic struggle during that same time between Greece and Turkey, the United States weighed in on behalf of Greece, not least because of religious affinities, seeking to inflame religious tensions between predominantly Christian Greece and predominantly Islamic Turkey. So when the United States seeks in the 21st century to invoke the antiquated, archaic, moth-eaten Monroe Doctrine, it once again exposes its hypocrisy and its ineffectiveness in trying to develop a foreign policy for the 21st century.
As we look at Elon Musk, he's doubting public awareness of World War III risk. Most people are oblivious to the fact that such a conflict could be imminent. Elon Musk is saying, and this is in our RT.
Well, I have to say I was taken aback by Mr. Musk's comments. He does not strike me as a person who's particularly perceptive or perspicacious, but even a stop clock is right twice a day. And Elon Musk is onto something when he warns of the danger of World War III. He's not alone in that regard. Look at the remarks of Secretary General Guterres with Portuguese roots at the United Nations, who has spoken in similar terms. We've spoken on this program about the noted French intellectual Emmanuel Todd and Le Figaro, who's spoken in similar terms. The problem is that that kind of awareness, as Mr. Musk suggests, is not widespread, although I dare say that given these upcoming anti-war marches in the United States focused on the conflict of Ukraine, I'm hoping that this awareness of the danger of this Ukraine escapade will leap into the forefront of public consciousness.
Quickly, what I find interesting about Musk's comments is he holds a number of very significant DoD contracts with his Starlink system, his SpaceX contracts. So I find it that he's speaking against his own interest, because when he came out and talked about Starlink, Joe Biden's response was, "Well, I think Elon Musk needs to be investigated." So I found Musk's comments to be counter to his own interest, or as they would say legally, statements against interest.
Well, perhaps Mr. Musk has come to the realization that a World War III, a worldwide conflagration, would not be good for business. He's walking a tightrope. On the one hand, the Starlink system supposedly is being supplied to Ukraine and enhancing its warfighting capability. At the same time, the profits for Tesla, his major profit engine, are heavily dependent upon the Chinese market. And as is well known, China is not very happy with this NATO conflict in Ukraine, with the fact at the NATO meeting last year in Western Europe NATO decided to increase its ambit and expand its ambit to include China, contradicting its idea that supposedly it only concerns itself with the North Atlantic. So Mr. Musk, I take it, is trying to sort out, like Mr. Biden, contradictions, and like Mr. Biden, is not doing so successfully.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.